everyone, I'm Abby Sharp. Welcome to Abby's Kitchen. So we're going to be talking a lot about intuitive eating over the next few months. But before we get too far into it, I really wanted to cover a topic that I get asked about a lot, and that is the idea of food addiction. Now, before we get into the research, and let me tell you, I had to put my full lab coat on for this one. I just want to say that I have tremendous empathy for those of you who are struggling with the feelings of food addiction. I know that a lot of you describe feeling out of control with certain foods, and you can only describe it kind of like some kind of addictive experience with food. And I know that it often feels like you need some kind of abstinence in order to maintain a sense of control. I am not discounting your lived experience. I know that it is so real for so many of you. However, I definitely want to give you some tools and some guidance that is informed by the literature.
Hey everyone, Switzerland here. I want to just chime in and acknowledge that I know that some of this guidance or these tools may not be tailored or suited for all of you. You know, I've tried to be really unbiased and open-minded in my analysis of this, even more so after my little epiphany here. But I do recognize that ultimately this may not perfectly encompass your unique experience. So take what you can from it and just know that the answer for you might be completely different. And that's why I always recommend working one-on-one with a registered dietitian when you can.
So first of all, what is addiction? Now, according to the Society of Addiction Management, addiction is a primary chronic disease of brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. Essentially, it's a change in the brain that results in a person continuously seeking out reward or relief from a certain substance like drugs or a certain behavior like sex. So addiction is diagnosed using a very friendly mnemonic ABCDE. An inability to consistently abstain, impairment of behavioral control, craving or increased hunger for drugs or rewarding experiences, diminished recognition of significant problems with one's behaviors or interpersonal relationships, and a dysfunctional emotional response. Furthermore, the DSM criteria for substance abuse disorder also includes spending a lot of time finding and seeking out and using the substance, an inability to cut back on using it despite trying to, and continuing to use the substance even though they or others know it's harmful. Finally, addiction usually includes some kind of cycle of relapse and remission. So then, what is food addiction? So the theory for food addiction involves a lot of the same criteria as traditional addiction. It would suggest that people with a food addiction have an inability to abstain from certain foods, crave them, and cannot control their intake of them. So the idea of food addiction can be partially related and attributed to the Yale Food Addiction Scale, which is a self-reporting tool used to measure kind of addictive-like habits related to food. It has 35 questions related to certain eating behaviors and is based off of the DSM criteria for substance abuse. It also asks if the person has significant distress in relation to food. So once completed, answers that meet the criteria for 11 different addictive behaviors related to food are tallied, and if a person has 3 or more of these behaviors, plus they experience some kind of significant distress related to food, they are diagnosed with a food addiction. While the Yale Food Addiction Scale may be useful in some settings, it doesn't really tell us that much. The scale is ultimately based on people's experience, not actual data about addiction, so it really only tells us about people's perceptions and feelings. It also doesn't include any questions related to dieting or restriction. So when a person is diagnosed with a food addiction, they aren't even screened for an eating disorder, despite time and time again research showing that these things are heavily correlated. That is a problem. So we don't actually know whether or not it's measuring anything that is different than an eating disorder. Meanwhile, one study that used the Yale Addiction Scale found that a persistent desire or repeated and unsuccessful attempts to quit a particular food was the only characteristic of food addiction that was commonly found. In other words, the other common characteristics of addiction were not common in relation to food. Even if this tool is not perfect, there are tons of other reasons why this concept of food addiction prevails. So let's dig into the research. Okay, so let's talk about, first of all, the dopamine response to food. Now, dopamine is one of the major neurotransmitters that are released from the brain when somebody does drugs. So from smoking a cigarette to injecting heroin, dopamine levels rise. One of the big arguments for the idea that food is an addictive substance is based on research that have shown that we have a dopamine response from food that is similar to our dopamine response from drugs. In a small human study, researchers gave participants either a tasty milkshake or a tasteless solution, and their brains were analyzed. The researchers have found that in the participants who had the tasty milkshake, they saw a dopamine response at 2 times. First, when the milkshake was consumed, and second, when that food entered into the stomach. So this dopamine release occurs in the dorsal striatum part of the brain, and it's the same part of the brain that releases dopamine when somebody does cocaine. Now let's talk about rats. Now, in a very famous 2005 study, 3 groups of rats were given a sugar solution. One group was given the sugar solution for 12 hours, the other group was given it twice, and the other group was given it ad libitum, which basically means they could have it whenever they wanted. So researchers then looked at the rats' brains and found that on the first day, all the rats released dopamine. Now, this is of course to be expected because we always release dopamine in response to a new novel food, just so that our body can kind of keep tabs on it in case it turns out to be like poison or something. So basically, your brain is kind of on high alert to new foods. Interestingly, the rats were only given sugar for 12 hours a day, binged on that sugar, and their dopamine levels continued to rise over the course of a month as they needed to eat more and more and more of that sugar in those 12 hours. The rats who were given free rein on the sugar did not demonstrate binge-like tendencies, which I'll talk about more later, and after day 1, their dopamine levels actually stabilized. In other words, it was the binge-like tendencies that produced a dopamine response similar to what we see with hard drugs. Next, let's talk about withdrawal symptoms. So another big reason why people really buy into the idea of food addiction is because of the research on withdrawal. Evidence from rat studies have found that when rats are used to eating sugar and then somebody takes that away from them, they experience a lot of withdrawal-like symptoms like anxiety, depression, changes in blood pressure, and heart rate. When researchers looked at the brains of these rats experiencing withdrawal, they found that their dopamine levels had dropped, which is also something that we would see in a person experiencing withdrawal from hard drugs. They also noted a rise in the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, which is also something that we would see in people who are experiencing withdrawal from drugs. And finally, let's talk about the behavioral response when we compare sugar versus healthy foods. The other major argument about why food, and particularly sugar, is unique in its addictive-like qualities comes from that 2005 study that we already discussed. So they gave the rats the healthy food intermittently, so for 12 hours, but they did not find that the rats binged in the first hour, and they did not increase their intake of the healthy food over time. Since the opposite was found when the rats were given sugar intermittently, the argument was made that there's something inherently unique about sugar that really makes it difficult not to want to binge on. Now, this all sounds really convincing, but let's first consider that a lot of these studies were largely rodent-based, and we can also view this from the opposing side. Now let's look at some of the research critiquing the idea of food addiction. First, let's talk about the dopamine response. So in contrast to some of the research I mentioned earlier, a full review of the literature in 2014 found no evidence that the brain reacts the same way to sugar and cocaine, and that sugar does not have the same neural hijacking on the brain that cocaine does. What actually may be a more accurate description of the relationship is that we have these pleasure centers in the brain that are firing when we eat, and that's a very natural, normal reaction. But actually that drugs are hijacking these natural pathways. Now, in addition to addictive substances like cocaine, we also see the same dopamine-like response to non-addictive stimuli and behaviors like holding your baby, humor, music, laughing, seeing somebody that you love, smiling, etc. Arguably, music and humor are not addictive, neither is smiling, but they are pleasurable, much like food. So based on that argument, to call sugar or any food addictive, you'd also have to call cuddling your baby addictive or buying a loved one a gift addictive. Okay, so then argument 2, this is a normal evolutionary response. Evolutionarily, it only makes sense for us to derive some pleasure from food. Otherwise, we would have no drive to obtain it in dangerous circumstances, and ultimately, we wouldn't survive. Our brains are designed to make certain things rewarding, like mating or eating, in order to prolong our species. Specifically when it comes to sugar, our bodies really depend on it, at least from an evolutionary perspective, as the preferred source of fuel and energy in the body. Furthermore, in one of the studies that I mentioned previously, they found that people had a harder time managing high sugar and high fat foods. This makes total sense from an evolutionary perspective. Fat is the most calorie dense kind of macronutrient, so we get the most energy for the smallest package, and sugar is immediately absorbed into the bloodstream, so we get fast energy. So if a food is calorie dense and has immediate energy, it makes total sense that our body is going to want to choose that over other kinds of foods. Now, in periods of deprivation and starvation, our body works in overdrive to kind of force us to eat. This can result in sending extreme hunger cues, which can lead to binging-like tendencies. While a lot of people may see this as kind of relapsing or giving into your sugar addiction, this is actually just a deep-seated biological survival mechanism. You didn't fail yourself by not pushing through your craving. This is completely natural and a healthy response to deprivation. What's more is that your body is really, really smart. It's going to look for the best, easiest option available with the least amount of energy required to get it. So what does that mean? Sugar, of course, because sugar is easily absorbed into the bloodstream with little to no digestion required. This just makes biological sense. And that brings me to the argument around restriction. Now back to that research looking at rats and relating sugar to cocaine. Now, despite seeing an initial dopamine response to sugar, which we talked about was totally normal based on any kind of novel food, the researchers only found these addictive-like behaviors and dopamine response in the rats who had their sugar restricted from them and who were then stressed out about that restriction. That means that when rats were able to have sugar whenever they desired, their brains did not light up the same way that they would to opioids. In fact, they responded just as they would to any other kind of food. The authors say it beautifully. Intermittent access is critical to the development of binging. This paradigm promotes a form of eating under uncertainty because food availability is unpredictable. So this was also seen in that older study with binging rats. So the rats that were given sugar access for just 12 hours of the day binged on that sugar, and then after 21 days, their sugar intake gradually increased. Meanwhile, the rats that were given access to sugar whenever they wanted did not binge, and therefore their total sugar intake was actually lower. And even though we didn't see that same desire to binge with healthy foods, suggesting that there may be something unique about sugar, which makes sense given the biological things we just talked about in evolution, I do think that this binge-like tendency can be mitigated simply by removing the novel or off-limits factor here. This is exactly why I hate the idea of cheat days. But that, of course, is rats. So let's talk about how things work in humans. Now, research suggests that people who feel that they have a food addiction tend to have a long, complicated history with food addiction and dieting. So when we finally allow ourselves to eat that forbidden food, our brains get excited and we can't help but binge and feel out of control. Research has found that people who have restricted certain foods for long periods of time actually react differently in the brain to certain food cues. And the researchers found that this may actually lead to a greater desire to obtain those foods. Regions in the brain affiliated with rewards were also more active, suggesting for these people, these restricted foods actually had become rewards. The result is that these foods become desirable, which may lead to overeating and the perception of feeling out of control. Furthermore, if we learn anything from diet culture, it's that when we restrict food, we are way more likely to kind of binge on these forbidden foods. In our eyes, these foods become so special, so novel, it's virtually impossible to not overdo it on them. So, does sugar addiction or food addiction actually exist? We don't really know. And while we don't know whether or not sugar addiction is technically real, there's really no denying that it often feels overwhelmingly real to you. And ultimately, I think that's what really matters. So what are the next steps? How can we move past these feelings of sugar addiction? Well, when a person's trying to recover from an addiction, it usually involves complete abstinence of the substance or behavior. For food addiction, this would mean abstaining from the problem foods, such as those that are high in sugar or fat. The problem is, this is basically a diet in disguise and could be detrimental to somebody who is suffering from disordered eating. In fact, it's probably going to exacerbate all the binge-like tendencies, as all of the evidence I cited suggests. One study found that 96% of people with self self-reported bulimia met the criteria for food addiction, while only 14% without an eating disorder met the criteria for food addiction. This was also found in another study that suggested that 30% of people who met the criteria for the Yale Food Addiction Scale also met the criteria for binge eating disorder. Coincidence? I think not. Generally speaking, when we're treating an eating disorder or eating disorder behaviors, we're looking at normalizing all foods rather than eliminating foods. As the research clearly suggests, to completely eliminate these certain foods from your diet will very likely exacerbate the problem. This just highlights how different the treatment paths needs to be for something like the feelings of food addiction compared to traditional addiction.
Okay, so I wanted to chime in here and address those of you who feel completely addicted to sugar, but who do not meet the criteria for an eating disorder. So you might be asking yourself or asking me, Abby, is abstinence the only answer? I also think it's totally reasonable that if something makes you feel out of control or unhealthy or uncomfortable, that you feel like you need to limit exposure until you can get those feelings under control. However, I do still believe that the long-term solution is not to just never look at a cupcake again, because hey, cupcakes happen and you want to be in a better headspace for when they do. Honestly, from a professional opinion, I would say that we just do not have any strong research to make any conclusive recommendations across the board. All I know is that this is a highly individual thing. And for that reason, my recommendation would be to really reach out and try to get a really good therapist and dietitian team to help you work through some of these feelings. That would be my professional recommendation.
As always, my job is to give an unbiased look at the literature and the research and help you unpack that. What you take away from that is completely personalized and up to you. I will also be sharing some more insights and information on intuitive eating in the months to come in my intuitive eating series, so I definitely encourage you to follow along. But by all means, this is not meant to be a comprehensive treatment or plan. I'm going to leave some links below if this is sounding a bit like your story. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up. Leave me a comment below with any of your questions. Don't forget, we're going to be covering a lot of this in the intuitive eating series. And of course, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time on Abby's Kitchen. Bye.